There was no warning before the flight attendant hit a black woman across the face in front of everyone. What she didn't know was that the woman's billionaire husband was sitting just 2 rows behind her, watching everything. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you're watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon to never miss a new one. She stood quietly in the first-class cabin, adjusting her shawl as Her name was Amara. She had smooth, dark skin, a graceful posture, and a calm face. She wore a soft beige dress with low heels that weren't flashy but were elegant. A few people looked at her but quickly turned back to their phones and newspapers. She didn't mind. She wasn't here to be noticed. She just wanted to relax in her seat and enjoy the flight. She turned her phone to airplane mode, slid it into her bag, and sat down near the window to look out at the bright afternoon sky. Her eyes softened. As she looked out the window, it was a peaceful moment that didn't last long. Suddenly, a flight attendant named Denise came down the aisle, checked people's tickets, and smiled politely at them until her eyes fell on Amara. Her face changed, and her steps slowed as she looked Amara up and down, her smile turning colder. At first, she didn't say anything. Instead, she walked past her, then turned around as if she was thinking about it, leaned forward a little, and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, are you sure you're in the?" Denise asked, looking at Amara's shawl and purse. Amara looked up, seemed confused, but was polite. She nodded and reached into her purse to pull out her ticket, which she then handed to Denise. Denise frowned more deeply and said, "This is a first-class ticket." Her tone changed, as if she were telling a child that this section was only for first-class passengers. "This is my seat," Amara replied softly. Denise's eyes narrowed, and she didn't return the ticket. She held it out and tilted her head. Flying alone, she asked loudly enough for a nearby passenger to hear. Amara gave a small nod of agreement, and Denise let out a breath through her nose, sounding annoyed. She slowly returned the ticket and straightened her back. "I'm going to have to ask you to remove your bag from the overhead bin and come with me to the back," she said firmly. "There may have been a system error." Amara blinked. "But this is my assigned seat, ma'am," Denise interrupted, sounding impatient. "I don't want to repeat myself," she said. A few people were watching, and some pretended to be interested. They pretended not to hear, but their eyes kept moving back and forth between Amara and Denise. Amara didn't argue. She reached up, took her bag down without help, and stood up quietly. Her hands shook a little, but she didn't show it because she didn't want to make a scene. She just wanted to sit and fly in peace. But as she walked into the aisle, Denise whispered, "This is what happens when people try to act above their station." Amara froze for a second. She kept her cool, but her chest tightened. She didn't say anything as she turned and started to walk toward the back of the plane. That's when she heard a voice behind her, Rose, from a nearby seat. Calmly, clearly controlled. "Is this how you talk to your passengers?" Denise stopped, her shoulders stiffened, and she slowly turned around. That's when she saw him, the man sitting 2 rows behind her, watching everything with no expression on his face or eyes. His name was Malik, and he was wearing a dark blazer shirt with no wrinkles. Even though he didn't sound angry, the weight of his words changed the air right away. Amara stopped in mid-step, and her eyes widened a little. She knew that voice, and she knew exactly who it belonged to, but no one else on that plane did. Denise's breath caught in her throat as she locked eyes with Malik's for a moment. She couldn't place him. There was something about the way he sat so calm and composed that made her uneasy. She gave him a tight smile and asked, "Sir, is there a problem?" Her voice was now thin and no longer carrying. Malik didn't answer right away. He looked at Amara, who was still standing in the aisle with her bag in her hand, and then back at Denise. "I asked you a question," he said evenly. Is this how you talk to every passenger or only the ones who look like her? The words hung in the air like heavy smoke, making some people move around in their seats. A woman near the window put down her phone to act like she wasn't listening, and the man in the aisle seat next to Malik looked sideways but said nothing. Straightened up and tried to keep up her usual tone. Sir, there's no problem here. There may have been a mix-up with the seating chart. I was just following procedure. Malik's eyes didn't blink as she showed you her ticket. Yes, but she still told her to leave. Denise opened her mouth and closed it again. She wasn't used to being asked questions like this, especially in front of other people. She turned back to Amara and asked, "Please take a seat in the back for now. We'll figure it out once we're in the air." Amara didn't move, she stood still. Amara looked at Malik, not sure what to do. He gave her a small nod and said, "Sit down." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a decision. Amara hesitated for a moment, then quietly sat back down and put her bag under the seat in front of her. She didn't look at Denise, she didn't have to. Denise stood there, her eyes darting between Malik and Amara. She parted her lips like she wanted to say something, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the silence in the cabin. Was Malik's voice, or maybe she was finally starting to realize who he was. She took a step back, muttered, "I'll tell the captain," and then turned and walked away, her shoulders stiff. Malik leaned back in his seat, picked up his phone, and scrolled slowly as if nothing had happened. His jaw was locked, and he didn't open his eyes until Denise disappeared behind the curtain. Inside the galley, Denise's hand shook as she reached for a cup of water, and her heartbeat slashed in her ears. She had dealt with. She had been around rude passengers before, but this man's voice and look had upset her in a way she couldn't explain. She tried to calm down by taking a sip and forcing her breath to slow down. One of the junior attendants, Tanya, a soft-spoken girl, looked over from the coffee machine and asked, "Are you okay?" Denise quickly answered, "I'm fine. I'm just fixing a seating error. That woman in two-way doesn't belong there. That probably happened during check-in." Tanya blinked. She had a first-class ticket. I saw her. Tanya opened her mouth and then closed it. She had learned early on not to argue with Denise, but something about the situation didn't feel right. She watched as Denise pulled out a tablet and started tapping the screen in the cabin. Amara sat perfectly still with her hands on her lap and her fingers laced together. Her eyes stayed on the window, but her mind was racing. She hadn't even processed this lack of shame yet. It all happened so quickly, and now she. Even though most people around her were acting busy, Malik, who was sitting right behind her, didn't say a word, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Amara hadn't expected him to be on this FL flight. He was supposed to leave the next day. She hadn't told anyone about her plans, not even Malik. But here he was, watching everything happen. She remembered what he always told her, "Let them show themselves, and I'll deal with it." He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened anyone, but as soon as he spoke, everything changed, and something told Amara that this wasn't even close to over. A few minutes later, Denise came out from behind the curtain, trying to look calm. Her lips were pursed and her steps were quick, but she didn't look directly at Amara or Malik. She walked through the first-class cabin checking seat belts as if nothing had happened, but her eyes kept flickering nervously to the cockpit door. She had already radioed the captain and reported a possible. When she talked about the incident with the confused passenger, she didn't talk about how she had yelled at them, embarrassed them in front of everyone, or the man who had stepped in because, well, she still didn't know who he was. But Malik knew what she had said, and he wasn't going to forget it. Amara sat quietly with her head tilted to the side and her eyes fixed on the window. She hadn't moved since she came back down, and she wasn't crying or shaking, but her jaw was tight. She took her phone out of her purse and slowly typed a message. She tried to move me out of my seat because she didn't believe my ticket. She made fun of me in front of everyone. She hit send and waited seconds later for the screen to light up with a reply that said, "Sit tight, don't say anything. I'll handle it." Malik didn't look up from his screen because he didn't need to. The situation at the front of the plane was already in motion. The cockpit light went off, and the captain picked up the phone. The flight attendant picked up the phone and said, "Yes." Denise's voice came through too calm to be honest. "Captain, there may be a problem with a first-class passenger. The woman in seat 2A. I think she may be in the wrong seat. There's some confusion." The captain frowned and said, "She has a valid ticket. I didn't check the manifest yet, but I think you think." The woman quickly realized her mistake and said, "I'll double-check now." The captain told her to do it quickly and don't make a scene. The woman hung up the phone and swallowed hard. Back in the cabin, Malik slowly raised his head and looked toward the curtain where Denise had just disappeared again. He didn't say a word, but there was a quiet calculation in his face, like someone was already writing the ending before the middle was even played out. The plane hadn't taken off yet, but the air had already changed. As the plane got ready to take off, people buckled up in their seats and settled in, but in the first-class cabin, comfort was gone and the air was tight. Amara leaned her head against the window and pretended to enjoy the view of the clouds gathering in the distance, but her mind was anything but calm. She could still feel the sting of the embarrassment from how Denise had looked at her, questioned her, and talked to her like she didn't belong. What was worse was that no one had said anything. Not a single passenger had spoken up. Not a single person had asked if she was okay. Only Malik had. She hadn't even known he was there. She hadn't seen him during boarding and thought he was on a flight. He spoke in a calm, steady way that made her feel like she was seen as more than just his wife. She felt like she deserved to be treated with respect. At the same time, Denise stood behind the curtain, holding the manifest more tightly than necessary. She looked over it again and saw that seat 2A was paid for in first class, with no mistakes, transfers, or upgrades. She still didn't believe it, or maybe she didn't want to believe it. Amara's quiet competence, the way she took her seat without hesitation, and the fact that she didn't seem nervous or lost were all things Denise thought a woman like Amara should look in first class. She folded the manifest and stuffed it into the folder with more force than was necessary. Tanya, who was standing near the back counter, watched her quietly. "She was on the list," Denise said, sounding like it was a problem she hadn't expected. "I figured," Tanya replied in a low voice. Denise didn't answer. She stepped forward too. Returning to the cabin, she almost pulled back the curtain, but she stopped herself and asked, "Do you know who that man was?" Tanya looked up and saw that it was the man who spoke up while sitting in for C. Tanya thought for a second number, but he didn't seem like someone you'd want to argue with. Denise narrowed her eyes as she remembered the way he looked at her, not angry but disappointed, as if she had told him something bad about herself and he didn't even have to say it out loud back in the cabin. He looked up from his phone and typed a short message with purpose. He wasn't smiling or tense, and his face had the stillness of someone who was totally in charge. He hit send and put the phone face down on the tray table across the aisle. A businessman who had been watching looked over at Malik and seemed interested. He opened his mouth as if to say something. Malik's silence made it hard to start a conversation. Amara spoke softly, "You were supposed to fly tomorrow." Malik's voice came back just as the soft plans changed. She closed her eyes for a moment to let the moment settle. She didn't ask how long he had been sitting there or what he was planning because she knew him well enough to know that he wouldn't move for no reason and that if he had changed his flight without telling anyone, he would have. As the plane took off, the ground slowly lifted away from under them. A calm voice came over the intercom to welcome passengers and give the expected flight time, but no one in the first few rows was paying attention because they were too aware of the strange, silent weight pressing down on them. Denise finally returned to the cabin and walked down the aisle as if nothing had happened. She didn't look at Amara or Malik, but she could feel his eyes following her every step. She tried to concentrate, but she couldn't. She kept her voice upbeat and offered drinks, but something had changed in her rhythm. She wasn't in charge anymore, and Malik hadn't even raised his voice. The seatbelt sign went out with a soft chime, and people started to move around in their seats more comfortably. Some opened books, others adjusted their trays, and some whispered to each other, but there was still silence in first class. Amara hadn't touched the blanket on her lap or reached for the magazine in the seat pocket. She sat up straight, her eyes steady, and she didn't move. She wasn't angry in the usual ways. It wasn't loud or crazy, but it was heavy, the kind of anger that sat deep in the chest like a stone. She had lived her life of grace, never wanting attention and never expecting trouble. But today had shown her how easily people looked at her and saw something else, something less, and Denise. Denise hadn't just questioned a ticket, she had questioned her right to belong. Denise was doing what she always did when a situation started to get heated. It was like she was practicing her smile as she quickly moved from row to row, serving drinks like water, juice, and coffee. But when she leaned down to serve the passenger in 1D, her hands weren't steady, and she shook a little as she put the cup on the tray. She was waiting for something to happen, like Malik to speak up again or Amara to report her, but so far nothing had happened, and the silence made things worse. At the galley, Tanya quietly asked her, "Do you want me to?" Denise quickly shook her head and said, "No, I'm fine." But she wasn't fine, and when she looked past Tanya toward the first-class curtain, she felt the burn of eyes. She couldn't see that man Malik, but something about the way he looked at her kept playing over and over in her mind, calm and sharp, like he knew something she didn't. In the back of the cabin, a flight attendant approached Tanya with a small piece of paper and whispered something. Tanya's eyebrows rose slightly. Denise didn't ask what it was because she knew it wasn't good. She turned her back on the card and tried to concentrate again, but things were already moving in the front. Malik tapped on his phone again, this time typing a short message, "Get me the in-flight supervisor. I want to talk to them before landing. Please don't make a scene. I want it to be handled professionally." He then put the phone down and folded his hands in his lap. Amara leaned slightly back, her eyes still on the pilot. She spoke to him through the window without looking at him and asked, "Are you handling it already?" Malik didn't answer right away, but he tilted his head slightly and said, "I told you before, people show you who they are when they think no one's watching." She slowly nodded, remembering those words he had said the first time someone followed her around a store as if she was stealing something. Now they were 30,000 feet in the air, watching the same truth unfold in a different uniform. Denise returned to Amar's row with A. She carefully put the small cup of sparkling water on the tray and said, "Here you go, Ma'am Amara." Amara looked up slowly and met Denise's eyes. "Thank you," she said, but there was no expression on her face. There was only silence. Denise stood there for a second too long and then turned away, but as soon as she did, she heard a low murmur behind her from another passenger. The person didn't even say sorry. Denise stopped in the middle of the step and kept walking as if she hadn't heard it, but she had, and so had other people in first class. Shifted the passengers, who had been quiet and uninterested before, were now watching everything with mixed feelings of discomfort and guilt because they had seen a woman being shamed in front of them and done nothing. Malik didn't need to raise his voice, and Amara didn't need to cry. The truth had already made its way around the cabin and was sitting in every seat, pressing on every passenger's conscience. Denise was finally starting to feel what it was like to lose control as the engines went quiet. As the flight went on, there was background noise, but there was also a thick stillness in the air. Uneasy people moved around in their seats, adjusted their blankets, and turned the pages of magazines they hadn't read yet, but their eyes kept going back to Amara. It wasn't because she was making noise or trying to get attention, it was because her silence made them uncomfortable. It made them think of what they saw and how they didn't say anything. An older woman in seat 1A clutched her purse a little tighter while pretending to read a novel, while a young man. Two people in the row behind him sneaked looks at Malik to confirm what he already thought. It took him a while, but it finally clicked. He had seen that man's face before, on TV, on a magazine cover, in a news interview. That man in the crisp black blazer sitting so quietly behind the woman who had been humiliated, that was him, the one who owned a tech empire and gave speeches about equity and leadership. That was Malik Harris, and no one else, not even Denise. Tanya came back from the cockpit and leaned toward Denise near the galley. Her voice was low and urgent. "You need to come up front," she said. Denise turned around, confused about what had happened. Tanya hesitated, then added, "The captain wants to talk to you right now." Denise followed her with stiff steps, aware that people were watching her every step as she walked down the narrow aisle. She tried not to show it, but her heart was beating faster inside. The captain sat stiffly in his seat and his face couldn't be read. Next to him on the secure video line was the airline's in-flight operations manager, with a serious face and a tie that looked like it had been pulled into the conversation in the middle of his shift. "Ms. Denise," the captain began, "we've just received a call from the corporate office. There's been a complaint about a passenger interaction in first class." Denise's heart dropped. "It was a misunderstanding," she began. The man on the video screen asked sharply, "Did she show you her boarding pass?" Denise paused and said, "Yes, but I didn't realize. Did you verify the name on the manifest?" "I did, but then you asked her to move before confirming her information." Denise opened her mouth to defend herself, but the captain raised his hand to stop her. "You need to understand something," he said, his voice getting firmer. "The man in seat 4C is Malik Harris." Denise blinked. "I didn't know that," the man on the screen said. "Forward, and the woman you embarrassed in front of the whole cabin is his wife." There was a moment of silence in the cockpit, and Denise felt her knees weaken a little. "He's already contacted legal," the captain said. "He hasn't made a scene, he hasn't spoken to the press, but he has every right to take this to the board, and from what we've been told, he's planning to." Denise tried to find the words. "It wasn't personal. I didn't recognize her. I was just trying to." When the manager cut in, "You didn't need to recognize her." The call ended, the screen went black, and Denise stood there still. The captain turned slightly in his seat and said, "You'll need to apologize right now, and you'll do it in front of the passengers who saw what happened." Denise's stomach turned, but she couldn't make an excuse. The captain said, "You caused this situation, now you fix it." He turned back to his controls, and the conversation was over. Denise slowly walked out of the cockpit, her mind blank. She walked toward the first-class cabin again, but this time she felt like a spotlight was following her every step. She walked past the rows of faces and looked into the eyes of those she had once ignored. Now she couldn't get away from the judgment. Amara sat calmly, sipping the water that had been put on her tray. Malik didn't even turn his head, but he didn't have to. She knew Denise was coming, and Denise knew this wasn't just a flight anymore, it was the start of a fall. Denise stood just past the curtain that separated the galley from the first-class cabin, her hand on the edge of the wall. Her legs felt stiff, her mouth was dry, and she could still hear the captain's voice. She had played this moment over and over in her mind during the flight, hoping that maybe everything would blow over, that Amara would just let it go, and that no one would find out who that man behind her really was. But all of her plans had just fallen apart. She walked slowly into the cabin and looked at the rows she had walked past with such confidence earlier. Every face she had ignored before now looked at her directly, some curious, some cold. Some were just waiting to see how she would try to fix what she had done. She walked forward until she reached row 2, where Amara sat with her back straight and her hands lightly folded on her lap. She wasn't cocky or rude, she just watched Denise walk up with the calm control of someone who had already won, not raising her voice or putting her hand behind her back. Malik sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the back of Denise's head. The weight of his stare felt heavier than a crowd. Denise swallowed. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," she said, her words stumbling out of her mouth. "There was a miscommunication earlier, and I acted too quickly, and I shouldn't have asked you to move seats. I'm sorry if I caused any embarrassment." Amara raised an eyebrow slightly. "A misunderstanding?" she asked, not angry but curious. Denise quickly replied, "Yes, I didn't mean to offend you, but you did." Amara said in a calm but clear voice. "I felt like I didn't belong here. That wasn't a system error, that was your judgment." Denise froze. She could feel the weight of every passenger's attention on this conversation. Amara didn't yell, she didn't need to, her tone was calm, collected, even soft, but every word carried. "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket." Amara continued, "You didn't doubt the man in 1C or the woman in 3A, only me." Denise opened her mouth to say something to defend herself, but there was nothing she could say. Someone behind them said, "That's right," and another passenger nodded quietly. Malik didn't say anything, his silence made everything louder. Amara leaned back in her seat, her eyes still on Denise. "If you're going to apologize, at least call it what it was," she said. Denise stood there, frozen in front of a woman she had tried to shame. She felt exposed in a way she had never felt before. This wasn't a private conversation anymore, this was a "Figuring I misjudged you," Denise finally said, and Amara nodded once. "That's the truth." There was a long pause, and Denise didn't know what to do next. Amara didn't scold her, thank her, or say anything else. She just turned back to the window and picked up her water. The conversation was over, and Denise slowly stood up. Her face was red, and she couldn't look anyone in the eye, not the woman she'd insulted, the man she'd underrated, or the other passengers who had helped her. She went back to the galley and stood still, holding on to the edge of the cart as if she were going to fall. Her legs felt weak, and her mind was racing. She felt like she had lost more than just respect. She had lost control of the story, and now she wasn't the one correcting others, she was the one being corrected. Tanya looked at her from across the narrow space and said quietly, "That was brutal." Denise didn't answer, because she knew it wasn't over yet. It was quiet again, but it wasn't peace, it was tension wrapped in silence. Denise didn't go back to the aisle for a while, she stayed in the galley and cleaned trays that didn't need to be cleaned. Her ears were still hurting, the apology hadn't helped, if anything, it had made everything more real. When she knelt in front of Amara and said those words, she went from being in charge to being exposed, and the silence that followed was painful. People in first class were surprisingly quiet. No one said much, but everyone was paying attention. It wasn't just about Denise anymore, it was also about them and how none of them had spoken up when it happened. Now they watched Amara differently, not with judgment or confusion, but with a quiet kind of respect and discomfort because they had seen it happen and looked away. Amara sat with her arms lightly resting on the armrest and her fingers slowly tracing there. She hadn't expected the apology, and when it came, it felt like Denise was only saying what she had to say and not what she really meant. It was the kind of apology people give when they're caught, not when they're sorry. She wasn't looking for revenge. She didn't want Denise fired or in the news. She just wanted things to change. She had seen women like herself being pushed aside too many times, talked to with fake smiles and heavy tones, and treated like guests in rooms they. She looked back for a moment, but Malik was still sitting there and reading a document on his tablet. He hadn't said a word, but Amara knew him too well to not feel the stillness he had when he was getting ready for something big. A few roses later, the man in 3B finally leaned forward a little to clear his throat. "I saw what happened earlier," he said softly to Amara without looking directly at her. "That wasn't right," Amara said. "That wasn't right." He nodded once, and then leaned back in his seat. He didn't know what else to say, but that one sentence changed something in the air. A voice from across the aisle followed it up quietly. "We all saw it. We should have said something." Amara didn't answer that one. She didn't need to. The shame in their voices spoke for itself. Up in the cockpit, the captain pressed the intercom button again and called down to the operations team. His voice was calm but clipped. "Make plans for executive handling upon landing." The voice on the other end said, "Mr. Harris asked for privacy for his wife, but he also wants a formal review to begin before the plane touches down." The captain nodded and leaned back in his seat, looking out at the empty sky ahead. This was no longer a flight. It was a moment that the whole airline would be talking about before the day was over. Back in the galley, Denise picked up the intercom and slowly dialed a direct number to crew control. The phone rang once before a man's voice answered. Her voice wavered as she said, "This is Denise Porter, flight lead on 827, and I need to file a preliminary incident report for first-class passenger misconduct, correction crew misconduct, and my own." There was a pause on the line copy that showed Denise hung up with her shoulders slumped. She felt like she was shrinking every minute because for years she had walked down plane aisles with authority, correcting passengers and demanding respect. She had become too used to being the last word. She was the subject of an official report. Her own voice had put her back in her seat. Amara slowly scrolled through her phone. Since the flight began, she had gotten dozens of messages, news alerts, and emails, but only one from Malik that mattered. She made a mistake, but what happens next is where the real lesson starts. Amara let out a slow breath. She had a feeling Malik wasn't going to stop at an apology. He was just getting started. The plane flew steadily through the sky, but the air inside the cabin was heavy with. It was a quiet kind of anticipation, like when people knew something bigger was happening just below the surface. First class was unusually still. People were talking and giving each other soft glances a lot. People who had been focused on their own comfort were now sat uneasy, not sure how to react to the change going on around them. Denise hadn't been to the aisle since she filed the report. She stood in the galley with her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes locked on the floor for the first time. At one point in her career, she didn't feel like a crew leader. She felt like a name on a file and a problem that needed to be dealt with. She had built her reputation on order and being able to tell who belonged and who didn't as soon as they stepped on board. She was proud of being able to tell the difference. But she was wrong, and now the shame wasn't just personal, it was professional. Tanya looked at her from the other counter and saw her fall apart. She said, "I checked your file once." Denise didn't look up 13 times, but Tanya did. "Then you know how quickly things changed," Denise said with a soft, bitter laugh. "Apparently not fast enough." "You're not the first one to make a mistake," Tanya said. Denise whispered, "But I might be the last one who gets to make one like this." Meanwhile, in the cabin, Amara finally closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to rest from the noise in her head. She had been standing up straight for hours, keeping her body calm, and her face was red. Although she tried to stay calm, It was hard for Grace to deal with rude comments. She had learned to hold her cool even when she felt like giving up, not because she was weak, but because Black women like her were taught from a young age that calmness is protection. She slowly let out a breath and rested her head against the headrest. She then felt someone move in the seat next to her and turned her head just slightly to see Malik. He had closed his eyes. He was still sitting with his legs crossed and one arm resting on the armrest. His expression hadn't changed, but his silence was louder than any words. She whispered, "You don't have to do anything else." He looked at her and replied softly, "That's not how I was raised." He then reached for the call button above his head, and a quiet chime rang. A few minutes later, Tanya stepped through the curtain, her face politely saying, "Yes, sir, I'd like to talk to the in-flight supervisor Malik." Chunk's voice didn't change, "That's Denise, sir. Please let her know I'm ready to speak." Tanya hesitated for a second, then nodded, "Yes, sir." She turned around and went back behind the curtain. When Tanya came back, Denise felt her stomach drop. "He wants to talk to you," she said. Denise nodded slowly, wiped her hands on her apron, and took a deep breath. Her palms were sweating as she walked toward row 4. This time, she didn't hesitate. She walked more slowly because she knew what was coming. She reached his row and stood next to him. "Mr. Harris, is it?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "Yes," he replied. She swallowed hard and asked, "Would you prefer to speak privately?" Malik replied, "Right here is fine." She gave him a stiff nod. "Okay," he said. "I'm not going to raise my voice. I'm not going to threaten your job. I don't need to. What happened today speaks for itself. You saw my wife and made a decision before she said a word. You checked a list before you looked at her ticket." Denise opened her mouth, but he held up a. He said calmly, "I'm not angry because you made a mistake. I'm angry because you felt comfortable doing it. You didn't hesitate. You didn't question yourself. You questioned her loudly in public and with the kind of certainty that comes from years of getting away with it." Malik's voice dropped almost to a whisper, but every passenger nearby leaned in to hear him. "You tried to shame her, and you did it in front of strangers thinking she wouldn't say anything, thinking she'd just move." Denise's face turned red. "She did," Malik said, "because that's what people like her do." Amara sat still with her eyes closed, listening to every word. But she didn't move because she was wrong. She moved because she didn't want to give you a reason to go further. She protected you from yourself. Denise couldn't breathe. "The only reason you're still standing here in uniform is because she gave you that chance," Malik said. The silence that followed was brutal. Denise gave a stiff nod, turned to leave, but before she reached the curtain, another passenger yelled, "I hope you remember this day." He said she didn't turn back, she just disappeared behind the curtain, and this time no one pretended not to watch. The rest of the flight went by like a long, tense breath that no one could let out. Time moved, but it felt slow. There was no one asking for extra drinks or a blanket, and the sound of glasses and ice seemed louder than usual. The first-class cabin was strangely quiet, like a courtroom after a verdict. Amara stayed in her seat, not stiff or cold, just calm. She didn't need to explain herself to anyone, her presence alone spoke for her. There was no anger or performance, it was just truth. It made people uncomfortable in the right way, it made them think. Malik silently checked his phone for emails and sent a few short messages in response. Even though he was focused, every move he made had a purpose. Not because Malik wanted drama, but because he didn't believe in silence that protected the wrong people. He sent the incident report, the video request, and the names of the passengers to his team. By the time they got there, the company's senior legal officer and board liaison would have a full summary of the event, date, time statements, names, recordings. In the galley, Denise sat alone on a fold-down seat with her hands clasped tightly between her knees. She had taken off her blazer and wiped her face. She thought about what she would say if someone asked her to explain what happened 3 times, but each version sounded worse than the last because there was no way she came off looking good. She had seen Amara and thought she didn't belong there. It wasn't about policy or protocol, it was about something deeper and uglier, and Denise knew it now. It wasn't the first time she had thought that way, but it was the first time the person she had disrespected had power sitting 1 row away. She rocked her temples to try to get rid of a headache that had been building since she saw Malik get up from his seat. Tanya walked in quietly with a bottle of water and said, "You should drink something." Denise shook her head and said, "I'm fine." Tanya stood there for a second longer and said, "They're calling it already." Denise's shoulders dropped as she heard the captain say that security was meeting at the gate with someone from the executive team. Tanya didn't answer, but it didn't matter. Back in the cabin, people were talking about the same thing in whispers. Couples and business travelers were having hesitant conversations. No one dared speak out loud, but they were all talking about the same thing. A man in 3C leaned over to his wife and asked, "Do you think she's going to lose her job?" His wife replied, "She should." Across the aisle, a younger woman whispered to herself, "I can't believe I just sat there." People who hadn't been involved were now asking themselves, "Why didn't I say something? I would have spoken up if he hadn't, but why was she being questioned before her ticket?" The plane wasn't just a flight, it had turned into a mirror. The intercom cracked again, and the captain's voice came through, "Gentlemen and gentlemen, please make sure your seat belts are fastened, tray tables are locked, and personal items are secured." Amara took a slow breath and buckled hers. She looked at Malik, who gave her a short nod and a quiet look that said, "I'm here." She put her hands in her lap and looked ahead. She didn't want revenge or anyone to beg, she just wanted real accountability, not a scripted apology or a free flight voucher, but change, and if Malik had anything to do with it, that's exactly what would happen in front of the plane. The cockpit phone buzzed again, and the captain picked it up and listened quietly. The voice on the other end told him that Mr. Harris's security detail had arrived at the gate, along with the company's executive. The officer was there and asked to speak with the crew right away after disembarking. The captain nodded once and then hung up. He looked toward the door with a sigh. He had flown this route for over 15 years and had dealt with turbulence emergencies and mechanical delays, but he had never landed a flight knowing that someone's career would end before the wheels even touched the runway. Back in the galley, Denise stood slowly, her body heavy. She straightened her short, tucked her hair into a tighter bun, as she did every day. The seatbelt sign had always made her feel in control, but this time it felt like armor that couldn't protect her. The city came into view through the windows, with small roads and buildings. Light broke through thin clouds inside the plane, making it even quieter. The descent had begun, and so had the consequences. The plane landed with a soft thud, its tires gripping the runway as its engines roared in deceleration, but no one in the cabin was relieved. There was no applause or arm wrestling. As the plane taxied to the gate, there was a stillness and a tightness of anticipation, as if everyone on board knew that landing wasn't the end of the flight but the beginning of something much more important. In first class, Amara stayed seated with her back straight, her face calm, and her eyes forward. She didn't look toward the galley or move in her seat, she just waited like someone who had learned a long time ago how to sit through uncomfortable silence without shrinking. Malik was just as. He calmly put his tablet into his carry-on and carefully zipped it up. Then he reached for his blazer. He moved as if time didn't exist. No one could touch his focus, but anyone who looked closely could see it. He wasn't ready for a conversation, but for a fix to the system that let things like this happen for too long. The intercom rang again. "Welcome to our destination, local time. It's now 3:45 p.m. Stay seated with your seatbelts on until the seatbelt sign goes off. Thank you for flying with us." That cold robotic announcement had never sounded so cold. The seatbelt light went off, but no one moved. All eyes went to the front of the cabin. The door hadn't opened yet. Denise stood behind the curtain, back straight, heart racing. She had pulled herself together physically. Her hair was neatly pinned, her uniform was smooth, and her name badge was clipped perfectly in place, but nothing she wore could hide how she was shaking. She wasn't just nervous about the conversation, she was terrified of what would happen next because she knew who would be waiting on the other side of that door. She wasn't ready for a debriefing, she was ready for judgment. When the door finally clicked and opened, the tension in the cabin broke like a stretched wire snapping. A tall, stone-faced security officer walked into the entryway with the confidence of someone who didn't speak unless necessary. "Is Denise Porter on board?" "That's me. Please gather your things. You'll need to get off the plane right away," he said in a calm voice that could be heard by everyone in first class. Denise stepped out from behind the curtain with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The words hit like heavy stones, and a few people gasped softly. Others exchanged glances, realizing that this wasn't being ignored, it was happening right in front of everyone. Denise hesitated for half a second, then turned, grabbed her bag from the galley, and walked slowly to the front of the plane, passing Malik and Amara. She looked at them with hope for some kind of last-minute mercy, but Malik didn't blink and Amara didn't move, they just watched. When she got to the door, the security guard moved out of the way and told her to go first. She stiffly agreed and stepped into the jet bridge, but what she didn't expect was to see two airline executives standing outside the plane with their arms crossed. Both were wearing suits and badges, with the older of the two standing. A man with silver hair and a tight jaw pointed to the side hall. "This way, Miss Porter," he said, and she did what he said without protest. Inside the cabin, the air stayed frozen, and people stayed seated longer than they had to, watching the scene unfold with quiet awe. Some whispered, while others avoided eye contact, but no one could say they didn't see it. When Amara finally stood up, she grabbed her bag and had Grace adjust the strap on her shoulder. She then turned to Malik, who was also standing, and put his bag over his shoulder. "Are you sure you want to?" she asked softly, with a half-smile on her face. He raised an eyebrow and said, "I didn't come all this way to sit behind you in silence." They walked down the aisle together, heads held high, not out of pride but out of principle. As they went forward, a man in 3A stopped for a moment to clear his throat and say, "Excuse me, Ma'am Amara." She looked at him for a moment and then gave him a soft nod of thanks. Another woman down the aisle stood and said, "You handled it better than I ever could." Everyone dealt with things in their own unique ways, and some people don't have the luxury of loud reactions. No one else spoke, and they didn't need to. By the time Amara and Malik got off the plane, the story had changed completely. Amara was no longer just that woman in C2A, she was the woman who had been wronged, stood her ground, and walked out without raising her voice once. Malik, on the other hand, hadn't needed to make noise. He had just sat there and watched the system play out its worst parts and made sure it didn't go. Denise thought the walk down the quiet corridor to the conference room was longer than the whole flight. For the airline, a new policy was about to be made, but it wasn't because of a press release, it was because of accountability on the record. Inside the sleek, glass-walled conference room just past the restricted area of the terminal, Denise sat alone at the long table. The fluorescent lighting above her buzzed faintly, and the silence felt too loud. A single water bottle sat empty in front of her. Resting on her knees with her fingers crossed and her knuckles white with stress, the wall clock behind her sounded like a countdown not to a meeting but to a reckoning. 13 years in uniform, thousands of flights, and hundreds of passengers later, her career was on the line because of a moment she couldn't change. The door opened, and in walked two executives. The first was the man with silver hair who had met her at the gate. His name badge said Edmund Shaw, Senior Director of In-Flight Operations. The second was a Denver woman in a Navy uniform. She put a thin folder on the table and slid into a seat across from Denise Edmund. Edmund stood there for a moment with his arms crossed and his face blank. "Miss Porter," he asked in a clinical tone, "do you understand why we're here?" Denise slowly replied, "Yes." "Then tell me what he said in your own words." She cleared her throat, but her voice was dry. "There was a misunderstanding. I asked a passenger seat in first class to move. She showed me her ticket, but I still asked her to move while the woman across from me." As she opened the folder, Denise paused. She didn't look like someone who usually flies first class. The words hung in the air like a confession. The woman nodded and started writing something down without saying anything. Edmund leaned forward slightly, and when she did what she was told and moved without making a disturbance, you thought that was okay. Denise hesitated at the time. "Yes, but I understand now that it wasn't." "You didn't ask anyone else to show their ticket," he said. "No. You didn't question the white couple who had just gotten on the plane." There was a pause, and Edmund stepped back and took a seat. "Do you know who her husband is?" the woman asked. "What do you think he's going to do with this incident?" she asked, looking up. "I don't know," Denise replied. "Whatever it is, I deserve it." There was another pause, and Edmund spoke. "We have a recording of the incident from the cabin security system. We also have statements from 7 passengers, the captain, and your own junior crew member. All of them confirm what happened as." The woman answered, "Because this is going to be more than just a formal review." Denise looked up, shocked. "That means the company's executive board has been notified. That means the incident is being treated as a priority case not only because of who was involved, but also because this flight exposes a larger pattern we can no longer ignore," she said, leaning forward a little. "You're not just here because of today. You're here because today is the day we finally got proof." Denise didn't say that. Edmund tapped the folder and said, "You're officially suspended without pay effective immediately. A disciplinary hearing will be scheduled within the next 10 business days. Until then you are not to wear the airline uniform, access company systems, or enter restricted terminals. Violation of these terms will result in immediate termination." Denise nodded. Her face was still, but her heart was breaking. She had spent years thinking she was fair, that her instincts were good, that she could read people, but they had been wrong. As Edmund stood to leave, he stopped by the door and said to Miss Porter, "If there's one thing you should take from this, it's that people are tired of being judged before they even sit down, and today you showed them exactly why." The door shut behind them, leaving her alone across the airport in a quiet private lounge where Malik and Amara were sitting next to each other. The room was dark and peaceful, with soft leather chairs and wide windows that looked out onto the. A private assistant brought them tea and then left without saying a word. Amara took a slow sip and looked at Malik. "That's it?" He shook his head. "That's the start." She raised an eyebrow. "There's more." Malik nodded. "The board meeting is this week. I've already sent in a full proposal. It includes mandatory bias training, an anonymous reporting system for quarterly cabin audits, and direct feedback channels for passengers who have experienced discrimination." Amara looked impressed. He smiled slightly and said, "I've been working on the plan." She leaned back and folded her arms. Now they don't have a choice. There was a long pause, and Amara looked down at her tea and then out the window. I didn't want her ruined, she said quietly. I just wanted her to see what she did. She will, Malik said, and she won't forget it. Amara nodded, because the most powerful lesson wasn't punishment, but being seen for once as the one who had the right to be there, with no excuses, just being, and refusing to disappear. As the sun went down, the lounge filled with golden light, and Amara took another sip of tea. She felt a sense of calm return to her chest. In the distance, the plane that had been carrying a quiet injustice now sat still, its door open, its silence broken, and its truth finally seen. By the next morning, the story had already started to spread, first quietly among airline staff, then loudly through private emails, travel forums, and finally within the company, and it wasn't because Malik had posted it. He hadn't said a word about it in public, but people talk, and passengers talk even faster when they see something they know other people won't believe unless they see it again and again. The version that spread the fastest wasn't the official report. It wasn't even the recording from the cabin. It was the memory of a poised black woman being humiliated without cause by a man sitting behind her who was calm but unshakable, a flight attendant being forced to silence in front of the very passengers she had tried to convince, and an ending where the silence worked against her. Headquarters meetings were called before noon, and legal teams scrambled to come up with language for the company's official statement. Public relations executives huddled over laptops, rewriting drafts over and over again to try to find the perfect balance of apology, accountability, and policy reform. Every word was weighed, and every sentence had stakes. The CEO, a tall, careful man named Richard Voss, looked over the internal memo with a stern face. He had worked with Malik before, in a funding round 4. He knew Malik wasn't a man of empty movements. If Malik had been on that plane and stayed silent until the end, the damage had already been done, and now the airline would have to pay for it. Across the city, Malik and Amara lived in a quiet estate with well-kept gardens and tall trees. As Amara stood barefoot in the kitchen staring at her phone, dozens of messages had been sent to her by friends, co-workers, and acquaintances who had read between the lines of an email. There were no names or airlines mentioned in the now viral post called "The Woman in Seat 2A." The details were clear and the story was told without embellishment. The woman didn't scream or cry, she just moved when told to, but she still became the problem until the man behind her stood up, and everything changed. Amara didn't know who wrote it, maybe a passenger or one of the quiet ones who had been watching but hadn't said anything until now. But it didn't matter, the story had. Life was happening now, and people were listening. She turned around as Malik walked in holding his phone and a folder in the other. He kissed her on the forehead gently and sat them both down on the counter. The board called this morning, he said. She raised an eyebrow. They scheduled a full review of in-flight behavior protocols. He replied that policy updates will be required, not optional. They're calling it the Thompson Clause after her. Amara stared at him. It's not public yet, he said. Slowly taking it all in, not out of pride but because she wanted a deeper, more real change, and it was written in her name, she sat down at the table and said, I didn't want all this attention. Malik sat next to her and said, You didn't ask for it, you earned it. She looked at him and asked, What about Denise? He was quiet for a moment. Final decision suspended until she submits a statement last night. What did she say? Malik pulled out a folder and handed it to her. Inside was a printed copy of her written apology, with no press-friendly language or legal disclaimers. Instead, it was a typed page shaking with confession. I made an assumption and acted on it, hurting someone who did nothing wrong. It wasn't about a seat, it was about the lens I chose to see her through. and if this cost me my job, I accept that because she deserved better and next time someone else will too. Amara read the letter slowly, and when she was done, she set it down. I'm not the only one who needed to read this, she said. There was a long, soft pause. Not all apologies fix everything, but this one did because it called out what was wrong, and once something is named, it can't be hidden again. Outside, the morning light stretched across the garden. Inside, Amara closed her eyes for a long time and then opened them again steadily. I didn't speak for a reason, she said. I know. Malik replied, because I wanted them to hear their own silence. He nodded, and they did. She looked down at the letter again and folded it. Malik smiled not for revenge or victory, but for memory, because some moments aren't meant to be nailed, they're meant to be remembered, and this one would be by everyone on that flight and by anyone who had ever been told without a word that they didn't belong. 2 weeks later, the airline released a public video statement, not a press release or a tweet with 3 bullet points and a hollow promise, a full statement recorded clearly admitting what had happened. What happened on Flight 827 was shown to millions of people on TV. The screen went black and then to the lobby of the company's headquarters, where Chief Operating Officer Elena Brooks, a tall woman in a navy blue blazer, stood at a podium with a single sheet of paper in front of her. She didn't have a teleprompter or a lawyer whispering in her ear, and she looked straight into the camera and spoke without flinching. There are moments that define whether a company is truly listening, she said, and Flight 827 was one of those moments. Racial bias, public humiliation, and improper treatment by a member of our in-flight crew. No passenger should ever be treated as though they don't belong, especially not in the seat they paid for. There was no denying that she was offended, it was just the truth. We want to make one thing clear, this did not go unnoticed, thanks to her husband Mr. Malik Harris's behavior, which was incredibly restrained and professional. We were able to see the holes in our system, which we are now committed to filling. The Thompson Clause, now official airline regulation, explained the new policy. Before any action could be taken, supervisors would have to confirm any seating challenge with digital ticket scans and internal documentation. Crew members would get training in bias and behavior every 6 months, with real-life scenario testing. Each plane would have a designated passenger advocate on the crew, and a new internal reporting system would let both passengers and employees report incidents directly to. The statement ended with words that no one expected from a company that is used to hiding behind rules. To Amar Thompson, Elena, keep your voice steady. We not only apologize, we thank you for your grace, your strength, and for choosing to stay seated when others would have left because of you. We are better. The video went viral within hours, not because it was polished, but because it was real. Flight attendants around the world shared it in crew forums, and passengers started sharing their own stories moments after seeing it. They had also been talked to differently, asked questions without a reason, and asked to prove they belonged, but this time was different because the silence had been broken. Back at home, Amara read the statement on her phone while sitting in the same chair where she had first read Denise's apology. The sun was coming in through the window next to her, casting soft shadows on the table. She didn't smile or cry, she just nodded when Malik walked in with a cup of tea and set it down in front of. He told her, "It's done." She looked up at him and asked, "Is that it for now?" He replied, "But not forever. Change doesn't end with one policy." She stirred her tea and thought, "But it has to start somewhere." He sat down next to her, "And it started with you." Amara looked down at her phone again. Her name wasn't in any hashtags. She hadn't posted anything. She hadn't held a press conference. But her story had moved without her having to shout. It had moved because it was true and enough people had finally decided to. A week later, Amara got a handwritten letter on airline stationery. It was simple, with no signature from a PR team and just the name Denise Porter. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know I stepped down. Not because I was forced to, but because I needed to face who I was becoming. Amara carefully folded the letter and put it in a drawer with the others, not to collect memories but to remember the weight of moments that mattered. She stood by the window and looked out the window. Peace filled the air as the tree swayed gently in the wind. It felt like justice for the first time in a long time, not the loud kind, the lasting kind, because this wasn't a story about a seat on a plane. It was about what happens when someone stands still and lets the world meet itself. This time, the world listened. If this story touched you, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Coming soon, thanks for your help.